The first night in the house, Rex didn't bark at a sound. He barked at the silence, frozen, staring at the basement wall like something was breathing behind it. Ethan followed, pried loose a cracked panel, and pulled out a rusted tin box buried deep inside, cold like it had never seen light. But Rex didn't move, just stared harder, as if it wasn't the box that mattered. Inside were names, coordinates, and one date, 2003, the year his unit lost a man who was never found. Then Rex turned, walked to the floor, and scratched once, twice, and Ethan realized the box wasn't the secret. It was pointing to something still hidden beneath his feet. Some things don't make a sound until they want to be found. The house sat at the edge of a narrow dirt road just outside Mill Creek, its wooden frame leaning slightly as if tired of standing through too many winters. And on that first night, when the temperature dropped to just above 32 degrees and the wind slipped through the cracks like a quiet visitor, Ethan Cole thought he had finally found a place where silence meant peace, not memory. He set his old duffel bag down near the doorway, boots still dusted with dried mud from the long drive. And for a moment, he just stood there, listening, not to anything in particular, but to the absence of everything he had spent years trying to forget. Beside him, Rex stepped in slowly, his paws soft against the worn floorboards, his ears high, catching something Ethan couldn't, something deeper than the creak of settling wood or the whisper of cold air moving through the walls. The German Shepherd didn't wander like a curious dog in a new place. He moved with purpose, nose low, tracing an invisible line through the dim hallway toward the back of the house where a narrow door led down into the basement. Ethan noticed the shift immediately, the way Rex's body tightened, the way his breathing slowed, focused, and without a word, he followed, one hand brushing the wall as he reached for the light switch that flickered once before casting a weak yellow glow down the wooden steps. The basement smelled like old metal and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to places that had been forgotten on purpose, and as Ethan stepped down, the boards groaned under his weight, each sound echoing just a little longer than it should have. Rex didn't hesitate. He moved straight to the far wall, stopping at a section of wood paneling that looked no different than the rest, except for the way he stood there, completely still, staring, as if the wall itself was staring back. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, though he already felt it too. Not fear, not danger, but something else, something familiar in a way he couldn't explain, like a memory that hadn't decided if it belonged to him yet. Rex let out a low, steady breath, then lifted one paw and pressed it gently against the panel. Once, twice, the soft tap echoing in the quiet space. Ethan stepped closer, running his fingers along the wood, and there it was, a slight give beneath the surface, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it, or unless something had led you there. He crouched, gripping the edge, and with a slow pull, the panel shifted just enough to reveal a narrow gap. Dust drifting down in thin streams as if the air itself had been holding its breath for years. Inside, tucked deep within the hollow space, sat a small tin box, its surface rusted and worn, edges dulled by time. Nothing about it remarkable at first glance, nothing that should have mattered, and yet Rex didn't move, his amber eyes fixed on it with an intensity Ethan had only seen a handful of times, the kind that meant this wasn't chance, this wasn't curiosity. This was something known. Ethan reached in, the metal cold against his fingers as he pulled it free, heavier than it looked, as if it carried more than just what was inside. And for a brief second, the room felt different, quieter, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment, for someone to finally open what had been hidden. He held the box in both hands, staring at it, feeling that same strange pull settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but something close. Something that made him realize that whatever he had come here to leave behind might have been waiting for him all along. The tin box felt colder the longer Ethan held it, as if the metal had stored years of silence and was only now deciding to let it go. And for a moment he did not open it. He just sat there on the basement floor, the faint hum of the house settling around him, Rex standing close, unmoving, watching not Ethan but the box itself with a focus that carried weight. The latch resisted at first, a thin layer of rust holding it shut, but with a careful press it gave way with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have, echoing through the low ceiling like a signal. And when Ethan lifted the lid, there was no flash of gold, no stack of bills, nothing that would make sense to anyone looking for something valuable. Only a bundle of folded papers tied with a faded piece of string, a small photograph curled at the edges, and a thin metal tag that caught the weak light. Rex lowered his head slightly, his breathing slow and steady, as if he already understood what Ethan was only beginning to feel, that this was not random, that this was placed, meant, waiting. Ethan untied the string and unfolded the top page, the paper dry and brittle, the ink slightly faded but still clear enough to read. And what he saw first was a list of names, written in careful block letters, each one followed by a set of numbers that looked like coordinates, latitude and longitude marked down to the last decimal. Precise, deliberate, not something someone would write casually. He frowned, his thumb brushing over one of the names, something about it pulling at the edge of his memory. Not fully formed, but close, like a word on the tip of his tongue. The photograph slipped from between the pages and landed softly against his knee. And when he picked it up, the breath in his chest slowed, not from shock, but from recognition, the kind that does not need explanation. It was a group of men standing beside a transport vehicle, uniforms dusty, faces lined with exhaustion, and something quieter beneath it. And there, near the edge, was a man Ethan had not thought about in years, not because he had forgotten, but because remembering had never brought anything back. The name came before the thought finished forming, Daniel Reeves, written in the same hand on the paper he now held, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not pain, not exactly, but the weight of a door opening somewhere. He had kept closed for a long time. Rex let out a soft breath, his tail still, his eyes flicking from the photograph to the far side of the basement, then back again, as if confirming something only he could see. Ethan turned the page, scanning the coordinates again, and one of them stood out immediately, not because it was different, but because he knew it, not the numbers themselves, but the pattern, the way it aligned with a place he had once stood, a place where the ground had felt alive. Beneath his boots, where silence had never meant safety. He shook his head slightly, grounding himself, reminding himself that this was just paper, just ink, just a box hidden in a wall. But the feeling did not leave. It settled deeper, steady and patient. The metal tag lay at the bottom of the box, small, worn smooth along the edges, and when he picked it up, the faint engraving caught the light. A simple sequence of numbers followed by a single word, below, etched with enough force to last decades. Ethan turned it over in his hand, the word repeating in his mind not as a direction, but as a memory, something that had once meant something specific, something urgent, and without realizing it, he looked down at the floor beneath him, the old boards worn and uneven, their surface marked by years of use and disuse alike. Rex moved then, not quickly, not with excitement, but with certainty, stepping away from Ethan and crossing the basement in a straight line, his nails clicking softly against the wood until he reached a spot near the center, where he stopped and lowered his head, sniffing once, then pressing his paw gently against the floor, the same deliberate motion he had used on the wall. Once, twice. Ethan watched him, the pieces not fully connected but close enough to feel, and when Rex stepped back and looked at him, there was no question in the dog's posture, only expectation. Ethan stood slowly, the tin box still open behind him, its contents spread like a quiet map of something unfinished, and he took a step toward the spot Rex had marked, the boards beneath his boots sounding just a little different there, a hollow note beneath the surface, subtle, easy to miss unless you were listening for it. He crouched, running his hand along the grain of the wood, feeling for the same slight give he had found in the wall, and there it was again, hidden in plain sight, a seam that did not quite match the others, a line drawn too carefully to be accidental. The air in the basement seemed to shift, not colder, not warmer, but heavier, as if the house itself was leaning in, waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan paused, his hand resting flat against the floor, the word from the metal tag echoing quietly in his mind, not as a warning, but as an invitation, and somewhere between the memory of a name he had not spoken in years and the steady presence of the dog beside him, he understood something he had not expected to feel again, that whatever had been left here was not meant to stay hidden forever. It was meant to be found by someone who would recognize it, even if only piece by piece, even if it took time. And as Rex let out a low, almost contented breath, Ethan realized that this was only the beginning of something that had already been set in motion long before he ever stepped into this house. The wood gave slightly under Ethan's palm, not enough to collapse, not enough to reveal anything obvious, but enough to confirm what Rex had already decided long before Ethan understood it himself, that there was space beneath this place, space that did not belong to the rest of the house. He shifted his weight and knocked once with his knuckles, then again, listening, the sound returning softer, hollow, like a quiet echo trapped under layers of time, and for a brief second, something in his chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, the same instinct that had once told him when ground was not as solid as it appeared. Rex stepped closer, his body angled slightly forward, ears high, his gaze fixed on the exact point beneath Ethan's hand, and when Ethan glanced down at him, there was no uncertainty there, no hesitation, only a calm insistence that felt almost human in its patience. Ethan exhaled slowly and stood, brushing dust from his jeans before walking back to the wall, where he had left his small pack, the zipper rasping softly in the still air as he pulled out a compact pry bar, the metal catching a dull glint from the overhead light. When he returned to the marked spot, the house seemed quieter than before, as if even the faint creaks had decided to pause, and he crouched again, sliding the flat edge of the tool into the narrow seam he had traced with his fingers. The wood resisted at first, the boards held in place by age and pressure rather than nails, but with steady force, the edge slipped deeper, and with a low, dry crack, the first board lifted just enough to break the seal that had held it down for years. Dust rose in a thin cloud, drifting upward in slow spirals, carrying with it a faint scent of old earth and something metallic beneath it, a smell that did not belong to a typical basement, a smell that hinted at something sealed away rather than simply forgotten. Rex took a step back, not in fear, but in respect, as if the space being opened was something that required distance. His tail low, his eyes never leaving the dark line, widening between the boards. Ethan worked carefully, prying up one plank, then another, setting them aside in a neat line as the opening grew, revealing a shallow gap at first, then something deeper, a darkness that did not reflect the light above but seemed to absorb it, as if it had not seen illumination in decades. He paused, resting back on his heels, looking into the space, letting his eyes adjust, and for a moment, there was nothing, only shadow and the faint outline of packed earth. But then, as the light shifted slightly, he saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to know it was not natural. A flat surface beneath the soil, something constructed, something placed. His heartbeat slowed, not racing, not panicked, but measured, deliberate, the way it had learned to be in moments when rushing only made things harder to understand. Rex let out a low breath, almost a quiet hum, and moved closer again, lowering his head toward the opening, his nose hovering just above the edge, not entering, just sensing, as if whatever lay below carried a presence that extended beyond its physical form. Ethan reached down and brushed away a thin layer of dirt with his hand, the soil dry and fine, coming away easily to reveal the corner of a surface that was not wood, not stone, but metal, smooth beneath the dust, cold even through his skin, and as more of it emerged, he saw that it was not a random piece, but a lid, rectangular, set into a frame that had been carefully concealed beneath the floor. The edges were flush, precise, the kind of work that did not happen by accident, and along one side, barely visible until the light caught it at the right angle, was a small recessed handle, folded flat against the surface. Ethan sat back again, staring at it. The tin box, the names, the coordinates, the word etched into the metal tag, all of it settling into place not as separate pieces, but as parts of a single path that had been laid out long before he ever stepped into this house. He ran his hand over the lid once, feeling the faint imperfections, the subtle scratches that spoke of use rather than decay, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to avoid what was there, but to steady the feeling building quietly. Inside him, the sense that this was not just something hidden, but something meant to be found in a very specific way, at a very specific time. When he opened his eyes again, Rex was watching him, not the floor, not the opening, but him, as if waiting for a decision that only Ethan could make. And there was something in that look, something steady and unwavering, that reminded Ethan he was not standing here alone, not in the way he had been for so long. He reached forward and slid his fingers into the recessed handle, the metal cool and solid against his grip, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for whatever lay beneath, for the years it had remained untouched, for the intention behind its silence. Then, with a slow, controlled motion, he pulled, the lid resisting just slightly before giving way with a deep, muted shift, the sound low and heavy, like something long asleep beginning to stir, and as the seal broke, a faint breath of air rose from below, carrying with it a scent that was neither entirely earth nor entirely metal, but something in between, something that felt older than the house itself. The opening widened inch by inch, darkness, giving way to the edge of a space below, not empty, not collapsed, but structured, deliberate, and as the first glimpse of what lay beneath came into view, Ethan understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that the box had never been the discovery. It had only been the invitation to something far deeper, something that had been waiting not just to be uncovered, but to be understood. The darkness beneath the lifted lid did not feel empty. It felt occupied by time itself, layered and still, and as Ethan held the metal edge open, the faint air rising from below carried a quiet weight, not stale, not sharp, but aged in a way that made the space feel preserved rather than abandoned. He leaned forward slightly, allowing the dim light from above to spill into the opening, revealing the top of a narrow ladder built directly into the side of the chamber, its metal rungs dull but intact, leading down into a space that extended farther than the shallow basement should have allowed. Rex stood close at his side, his posture steady, his ears angled forward, not tense, not alarmed, but attentive in the way he had been trained to observe what others could not see. And when Ethan glanced at him, the dog gave a small, almost imperceptible shift of weight, as if confirming that this was the direction they were meant to take. Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the opening, with one hand while placing his boot carefully onto the first rung, testing it, feeling the solid resistance beneath his weight, and when it held, he lowered himself down, one step at a time, the faint scrape of metal against his boots echoing softly as he descended. The temperature changed as he moved deeper, not drastically, but enough to notice, a steady coolness that wrapped around the space, carrying with it a sense of stillness that felt intentional, as if whatever had been placed here had been meant to last. When his boots touched the ground below, the sound was muted, absorbed by a floor that was not bare dirt, but something smoother, more deliberate, and he stepped aside to allow Rex to follow, the dog descending with quiet precision, landing lightly beside him, his nose already lifting, testing the air. The light from above reached only so far, fading into shadow at the edges of the room, but as Ethan's eyes adjusted, shapes began to form, outlines of objects arranged with care rather than scattered by neglect, a table against one wall, a set of shelves along another, and in the center, a cleared space that felt less like storage and more like intention. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on, the narrow beam cutting through the dimness and revealing details that the overhead light could not reach, the surface of the table marked with faint lines, the shelves holding a series of sealed containers, each one labeled in the same careful handwriting he had seen in the papers above. Rex moved slowly through the room, not rushing, not searching randomly, but tracing a path as if following something remembered, his steps measured, his attention shifting from one point to another with quiet certainty. Ethan followed the beam of his light across the wall and stopped when it caught on something familiar, not immediately recognizable, but close enough to pull at him. A map pinned carefully in place, its edges worn but preserved, marked with small symbols and coordinates that mirrored those in the papers he had found. He stepped closer, raising the light, and as the details came into focus, the connection settled in fully, the names, the numbers, the locations, all part of a pattern that had been mapped out long before he had ever seen it, a network of points that seemed unrelated at first glance, but together formed something structured, something planned. Rex paused near the table, his head tilted slightly, then lowered his nose toward a small object resting near the edge, a closed journal bound in dark material, its surface smooth despite the years, as if it had been handled often before being left behind. Ethan approached slowly, his hand hovering over it for a moment before lifting it gently. The weight of it heavier than expected, not physically, but in the way it seemed to carry. Something more than its pages. He opened it carefully, the spine resisting just slightly before giving way, and inside, the same handwriting greeted him again, steady and deliberate, each line written with intention, not rushed, not careless. The first page held a single sentence, centered, simple, and unmistakably meant to be read by whoever found it. If you are here, then you already understand more than you think. And Ethan felt a quiet shift in his chest, not confusion, not fear, but a recognition that this place, this hidden room beneath a forgotten house, had not been left to chance. It had been prepared for someone who would follow the signs, someone who would listen, someone who would not turn away at the first layer of mystery. Rex let out a soft breath, settling beside him, his presence steady and grounding. And as Ethan turned the next page, the beam of light catching the ink in a way that made it seem almost fresh despite the years, he realized that whatever story had begun long before he arrived here was not finished. It had simply been waiting, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to continue. The words on the page did not rush Ethan. They settled into him slowly, like something that had been written with the understanding that whoever found it would need time to catch up. And as his eyes moved across the next lines, the steady rhythm of the handwriting felt almost familiar, not because he had seen it before, but because it carried the same kind of discipline he had known years ago, the kind that came from people who understood patience, precision, and the weight of unfinished things. The journal did not begin with explanations. It began with observations, notes about places, coordinates that matched the ones in the box above, each entry dated carefully, spaced out over months, sometimes years, as if the person writing it had been following something that revealed itself slowly rather than all at once. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his presence quiet but constant, his eyes occasionally lifting from the room to the journal, then back again, as if he understood that what mattered now was not just the space they had entered, but the story unfolding within Ethan's hands. Ethan turned another page, the faint sound of paper brushing against paper echoing softly in the enclosed space, and the beam of his flashlight revealed a small diagram drawn in the margin, a simple outline of a structure, marked with symbols that resembled the layout of the house above, but altered, extended, as if the building had always been more than what it appeared on the surface. He glanced up instinctively, looking around the room again, seeing it differently now, not just as a hidden chamber, but as part of something larger, something that had been designed with intention rather than necessity. The air felt still, but not lifeless. It held a kind of quiet awareness, as if the space had been waiting not just to be opened, but to be understood. His eyes returned to the page, and this time the words shifted slightly in tone, no longer just observations, but reflections, written in a way that suggested the writer had begun to realize something about what they were documenting. Something that went beyond maps and coordinates. Ethan read slowly, taking in each line, the meaning forming gradually rather than all at once. And though the journal did not name anything directly, it hinted at a pattern, a connection between places that did not seem related on the surface, but shared something beneath, something that could not be seen unless someone was willing to look deeper. Rex stood then, moving away from Ethan with the same quiet certainty he had shown from the beginning, his steps measured as he crossed toward the far wall where the shelves stood, his nose lifting toward one of the sealed containers, lingering there for a moment before shifting to the next, as if he were tracing the same pattern described in the pages. Ethan watched him, the pieces aligning slowly, not through sudden realization, but through a steady accumulation of detail, each small observation building towards something larger. He closed the journal briefly, holding it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, not just as an object, but as a record of time, of intention, of someone who had chosen to leave this behind in a way that could only be understood by someone willing to follow the same path. When he opened it again, the next section of pages held something different, not just writing, but entries marked with small annotations, circles around certain coordinates, notes in the margins that suggested changes, adjustments, as if the writer had been refining their understanding over time. One line stood out, written slightly darker than the others, as if it had been pressed into the page with more force. It is not the places themselves, but what connects them. And Ethan felt that quiet pull again, the sense that this was not about finding something in one location, but about understanding a network, a pattern, that extended beyond any single point. Rex returned then, stopping near Ethan, his gaze lifting briefly before lowering again to the journal, and for a moment, the room felt balanced, the silence no longer empty, but filled with a quiet presence that neither of them questioned. Ethan flipped a few more pages, and this time he found something tucked between them, a thin sheet of paper folded carefully, separate from the rest. And when he unfolded it, the handwriting was the same, but the message was different, shorter, more direct. Some things are hidden because they are meant to be protected, others are hidden because they are waiting. And beneath it, a single coordinate circled in red, one that did not match the others, one that felt set apart. Ethan studied it, the numbers settling into his mind, not fully understood, but not unfamiliar either. And as he looked up again, scanning the room, the shelves, the map, the carefully arranged objects, he realized that this place was not the end of anything. It was a starting point, a place where pieces came together just enough to reveal the next step, but not enough to give everything away. Rex shifted closer, pressing lightly against Ethan's leg, a small gesture, grounding, steady, and Ethan rested his hand briefly on the dog's back, feeling the warmth there, the quiet reassurance that whatever this was, whatever had been left behind, it was not something he had to face alone. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the room. Once more, lingering on the map, the shelves, the ladder leading back up, and then returning to the journal in his hands. And as he closed it carefully, holding it against his chest for a moment longer than necessary, he understood something he had not expected when he first stepped into the house, that this was not about uncovering a secret for the sake of knowing it. It was about following something that had been set in motion long ago, something that required patience, attention, and a willingness to continue even when the path was not fully clear. And as the quiet settled around them again, deeper now, more settled, Ethan realized that whatever lay ahead was already reaching toward him, not with urgency, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that was impossible to ignore. The room did not change, but Ethan did, and that was enough to make everything feel different as he stood there holding the folded page with the circled coordinate, the weight of it settling deeper than the journal itself, not heavy in his hands, but heavy in meaning, like something that had waited for the right moment to be seen. Rex moved again, not toward the ladder this time, not toward the shelves, but toward the far corner of the room where the light from Ethan's flashlight barely reached. His steps slow, deliberate, his nose low, as if following a trail that had long since faded from the air, but not from instinct. Ethan watched him for a moment before following, the beam of light shifting with each step, brushing over the walls and catching small details he had missed before, faint markings etched into the surface, not random scratches, but symbols, subtle and nearly invisible unless the light hit them just right. The same shapes he had seen on the map, repeated here in a pattern that felt less like decoration and more like a quiet language. When he reached the corner, Rex had already stopped, his body angled slightly toward the wall, his ears forward, his attention fixed on a narrow vertical seam that split the surface almost perfectly, a line so clean it could have been mistaken for part of the construction if not for the way Rex stood there, as if the line itself mattered more than the wall around it. Ethan raised the flashlight, tracing the seam with the light, and there it was again, that same precision. The same intention he had seen in the hidden lid beneath the floor, not an accident, not a flaw, but a choice. He reached out, pressing his fingers lightly against the surface, feeling for the slightest shift, and after a moment, he found it, a small indentation near the edge, just enough to suggest that the panel could move if approached the right way. He hesitated briefly, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, the sense that each step deeper into this place carried its own weight, its own consequence, not dangerous, but meaningful in a way that required attention. Rex let out a soft breath, almost a quiet encouragement, and Ethan pressed the indentation gently, the panel responding with a muted click that echoed softly through the room, followed by a slow, controlled movement. As the section of wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow compartment hidden behind it, the air that slipped out was cooler, carrying a faint scent of metal and something older, something preserved rather than forgotten. And as the opening widened, the beam of light revealed a small, carefully arranged space within, no larger than a foot deep, lined with the same smooth material as the chamber below. Inside rested a single object, placed at the center with deliberate care, a rectangular case. Dark and unmarked, its surface matte and untouched by rust or dust, as if it had been sealed away from time itself. Ethan reached in slowly, his hand steady as he lifted the case, surprised by how light it felt, not empty, but balanced, like something designed to be carried rather than stored. Rex stepped closer, his nose hovering just inches from the object, his breathing slow, his posture calm, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, the quiet settling deeper as if acknowledging that something had just been found that mattered. Ethan turned the case over in his hands, searching for a latch, a hinge, anything that would explain how it opened, and along one edge, barely visible, he found a thin seam, running the length of the surface, accompanied by a small recessed point that responded to pressure. When he pressed it, the case opened smoothly, silently, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment, revealing its contents without resistance. Inside, resting against a fitted interior, was a device, compact, metallic, its surface marked with the same symbols Ethan had seen on the walls and the map, its design unfamiliar but not entirely foreign, something that felt both old and advanced at the same time. Beside it lay a folded card, smaller than the pages in the journal, its edges sharp, its surface clean, and when Ethan picked it up, the handwriting greeted him again, steady and unmistakable. The pattern is not complete without you. And below it, a second line, shorter, more direct. You already know where to go next. Ethan's eyes lingered on the words, the meaning not fully clear, but not distant either, the coordinate from the folded page in his pocket aligning quietly with the message, forming a connection that did not need to be forced. Rex shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving from the device to Ethan, then toward the ladder leading back up, and in that simple motion, there was a clarity that Ethan could not ignore, not a command, not urgency, but direction. He closed the case carefully, holding it in both hands for a moment before tucking it securely into his pack, the movement deliberate, measured, as if acknowledging that whatever this was, it was not meant to be rushed. The room around them remained still, unchanged, but Ethan no longer saw it as a place of discovery. Alone, it had become something else, something closer to a beginning than an end, and as he turned toward the ladder, Rex already stepping ahead of him with quiet confidence, he understood that the next step had already been set in motion, not by chance, but by a path that had been waiting for him long before he ever knew it existed. The climb back up felt different than the descent, not heavier, not slower, but more deliberate, as if each rung of the ladder marked a quiet transition from discovery to decision. And when Ethan emerged into the basement again, the air above seemed thinner somehow, less still, as though the house itself had shifted in subtle recognition of what had been uncovered beneath it. Rex moved ahead without hesitation, his paws silent against the floorboards, his direction clear, not toward the front of the house, not toward the door, but toward the narrow hallway where the faint outline of the outside world waited beyond wood and glass. Ethan followed, the pack resting firmly against his shoulders, the weight of the case inside barely noticeable physically, yet impossible to ignore in every other way. And as he stepped into the main room, the quiet of the house no longer felt empty. It felt observant, as if something unseen had been waiting not just for movement, but for understanding. The first light of morning had begun to edge through the windows, pale and soft, stretching across the worn floor in long, quiet lines that carried no urgency, only time moving forward as it always did, indifferent to what had changed beneath the surface. Ethan paused near the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, and for a moment he simply stood there, not thinking, not planning, but allowing the pieces to settle, the journal, the map, the hidden chamber, the device, and the words that had been left behind, all of it forming something that did not demand immediate answers, only attention. Rex stepped outside first, the door opening with a low creak that seemed louder in the morning stillness, and the dog paused just beyond the threshold, his head lifting slightly, his ears turning as he tested the air, not searching, not uncertain, but orienting himself to something that extended beyond the house, beyond the yard, beyond what could be seen. Ethan followed, stepping onto the porch where the wood felt cooler beneath his boots, the air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant pine, the kind of morning that felt untouched, as if the world had not yet fully woken. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper with the circled coordinate, the numbers steady and precise, and as he looked out over the quiet stretch of land beyond the house, something in him recognized the direction before he consciously traced it, not from memory alone, but from the way the place felt, the subtle alignment of landscape and instinct that had guided him more than once before. Rex moved down the steps, his pace unhurried, his path clear, heading toward the edge of the property where the trees began, their trunks spaced unevenly, their shadows stretching long across the ground, and Ethan watched him for a second before following, not because he needed to be led, but because he understood that whatever this was, it was meant to be walked, not just understood from a distance. The ground beneath his boots shifted from wood to packed dirt, then to softer earth as he moved farther from the house, each step carrying him away from what he had known into something that had already begun to take shape without him realizing it. Rex stopped once near the edge of the trees, turning his head slightly, not looking back for confirmation, but simply acknowledging Ethan's presence before continuing forward, deeper into the quiet line of forest that bordered the land. The light filtered differently there, softer, broken into narrow beams that moved with the slight motion of branches overhead, and the air cooled just enough to make each breath feel more defined, more present. Ethan walked steadily, the paper still in his hand, the numbers no longer abstract but connected to the direction he was already moving. And after a few minutes, the ground began to slope gently downward, the trees thinning slightly to reveal a narrow path that looked less like something made and more like something worn over time, subtle, easy to miss unless you were already looking for it. Rex followed that path without hesitation, his steps sure, his attention forward, and Ethan realized then that the coordinate had never been just a point on a map. It had been a continuation, a line extending from one place to another, each step revealing the next without forcing it. The house disappeared behind them, not abruptly, but gradually, fading from view as the trees closed in and the path curved slightly. And for the first time since stepping into the basement, Ethan felt something shift fully into place, not as an answer, but as acceptance, the understanding that this was not something to be solved all at once, but something to be followed, one piece at a time. Rex slowed then, his body lowering slightly as he approached a small clearing where the ground leveled out. And he stopped at the center, his nose lifting, his ears steady, his entire posture focused on a single point just ahead. And when Ethan stepped beside him, looking in the same direction, he saw it. Not immediately obvious, not marked by anything that would draw attention from a distance, but there nonetheless, a subtle change in the ground, a pattern that did not match the natural lines around it, a shape that suggested something beneath the surface waiting to be uncovered. And as the quiet settled around them once more, deeper now, more intentional, Ethan understood that the path had already brought him exactly where he was meant to stand, even if he did not yet know what he was about to find. The ground in the clearing did not look disturbed at first, not in any obvious way. But the longer Ethan stood there, the more the subtle differences began to separate themselves from the natural pattern of the forest floor, the way the soil settled just slightly flatter in one section, the way the fallen leaves seemed thinner there, as if they had been brushed aside more than once over time. Rex stood still at the edge of it, his body quiet but focused, his gaze fixed on the center of the shape as though it carried a signal too faint for anything but instinct to detect. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into the earth with a soft, damp sound, and as he crouched, he brushed his hand across the surface, feeling the texture shift beneath his fingers. Not just soil, but something beneath it, something solid enough to resist the pressure in a way that did not belong to the natural ground. He cleared a small patch with his hand, pushing aside leaves and loose dirt until the edge of a surface revealed itself, smoother than stone, more uniform than wood. And as more of it came into view, the outline became clearer, a rectangular form set into the earth, hidden carefully but not permanently. The same deliberate intention he had seen in the basement, repeated here with the same quiet precision. Rex stepped closer, lowering his head just enough to hover above the exposed section, his breathing steady, his posture calm, as if confirming that this, too, was part of the path they had already begun to follow. Ethan leaned back slightly, taking in the size of it, larger than the hidden lid beneath the house, wider, deeper, as if what lay below was meant to hold more than a single chamber, and for a moment, he simply watched it, the forest around him silent except for the faint movement of branches overhead, the light shifting in slow patterns across the ground as the morning advanced. He reached into his pack and pulled out the small pry bar again, the metal cool in his hand, familiar now in a way that steadied him, and he worked carefully along the edge of the buried structure, clearing more of the dirt until he found a seam, a thin line that marked where the surface could open, just as it had beneath the house. The soil came away more easily than expected, as if it had been placed rather than compacted by time, and when he slid the edge of the tool into the seam, the resistance was minimal, the lid responding with a controlled shift rather than a struggle. The earth around it barely disturbed as it lifted. The sound was muted, a low movement rather than a crack, and as the opening widened, a darker space beneath revealed itself, deeper than the one in the basement, the light from above reaching only the first few feet before fading into shadow. Ethan paused, resting the tool beside him, and leaned forward slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust, and for a moment, there was nothing but depth, a quiet, waiting darkness that felt less like emptiness and more like a continuation of something already begun. Rex moved first, not stepping down, but circling the opening once, his nose tracing the edge, his ears alert, his attention focused not just downward but outward, as if listening for something that extended beyond the immediate space. Ethan followed his movement with his eyes, then looked back into the opening, and this time, as the light shifted again, he saw it, not the full shape, but enough to recognize the structure below, a series of steps carved into the side, descending deeper into the ground at a steeper angle than the ladder beneath the house, and along the walls, faint markings, the same symbols repeated again, forming a pattern that felt less like decoration and more like a guide. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest in a steady stream, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes, not to avoid what lay ahead, but to anchor himself in the present, in the quiet, in the simple fact that each step so far had led him exactly where he needed to be without force or confusion. When he opened them again, Rex was watching him, his posture steady, his expression calm, and in that look, there was no urgency, no demand, only the same quiet certainty that had guided them from the house to this place. Ethan reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper once more, the circled coordinate aligning with the direction he now faced, confirming what he already understood without needing to say it aloud. He folded it back carefully and placed it inside his jacket, then picked up the pry bar and set it aside, knowing he would not need it for what came next. The forest around them remained still, the light filtering softly through the branches, the air carrying only the faintest movement, and as Ethan stepped closer to the edge of the opening, placing his boot onto the first carved step, he felt that same quiet shift again, not fear, not hesitation, but recognition, the sense that this was not a place he had stumbled upon, but a place he had been led to, piece by piece, moment by moment. Rex stepped forward beside him, aligning himself with the descent without hesitation, and as they began to move downward together, the light above narrowing behind them, Ethan understood that whatever waited below was not separate from what he had already found. It was part of the same pattern, the same path, one that did not end at discovery, but continued through understanding, step by quiet step. The deeper Ethan stepped, the quieter the world above became, not fading all at once, but thinning gradually until even the faint sounds of the forest felt distant, like memories rather than present noise. And with each step down the carved path, the air cooled just enough to make every breath feel deliberate, measured, as if the space itself encouraged stillness rather than movement. The walls on either side of the descent grew smoother the farther they went, the roughness of earth giving way to something more shaped, more intentional, and the symbols etched along the surface began to appear more frequently, no longer scattered, but aligned, forming sequences that seemed to guide rather than decorate, each marking placed with purpose, each repetition reinforcing a pattern Ethan could feel even if he could not yet fully interpret. Rex moved just ahead of him, his paws landing softly on each step, his body relaxed but focused, not scanning for danger, but tracking something deeper, something that did not rely on sight alone. And every so often he would pause for a fraction of a second, his ears adjusting, his head tilting slightly, as if confirming direction before continuing forward. Ethan followed without hesitation, the flashlight beam steady in his hand, cutting a narrow path through the dimness, illuminating just enough to move safely, but never enough to reveal everything at once, and that felt right to him. The way the light revealed only what was needed, step by step, mirroring the way everything else had unfolded so far. The descent did not last long in distance, but it carried a sense of depth that stretched beyond physical measurement. And when the steps finally leveled out into a flat surface, Ethan slowed, allowing his eyes to adjust to the new space as the beam of light widened slightly, revealing a chamber that felt different from the one beneath the house. Not smaller, not larger, but quieter, in a way that suggested it had not been entered for far longer. The floor beneath his boots was smooth and even, free of debris, as if it had been protected from the shifting of time, and the walls curved slightly inward, forming a space that felt enclosed without being confined, the air steady, unmoving, carrying none of the dust or decay that usually followed forgotten places. Rex stepped into the center of the chamber and stopped, his body still, his head raised slightly as he looked toward the far side where the light barely reached, and Ethan followed his gaze, lifting the beam slowly until it settled on what at first appeared to be nothing more than another section of wall. But the longer he looked, the clearer it became that it was not the same. The surface smoother, darker, marked with a larger version of the symbols he had seen before, arranged in a circular pattern that seemed to draw the eye inward rather than outward. He took a step closer, then another, the sound of his boots soft against the floor, and as he approached, the details sharpened, the lines of the symbols precise, each one connected to the next in a way that felt less like writing and more like a map without direction, a pattern that required presence rather than interpretation. Rex moved beside him, his posture calm, his gaze fixed on the center of the circular design, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence settling around them not as emptiness, but as something complete, something that did not need to be filled. Ethan reached into his pack slowly, his fingers finding the case without looking, and when he pulled it free, the motion felt natural, expected, as if this moment had been part of the path from the beginning. He held it in both hands, the surface cool, steady, and when he looked back at the wall, the connection was no longer subtle, the symbols on the device matching those etched into the surface before him, not identical in shape, but aligned in meaning, as if one had been created to respond to the other. Rex shifted slightly, stepping to the side, giving Ethan space, but not distance, his presence still close enough to ground the moment without interrupting it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and stepped forward until he stood just within reach of the wall, the circular pattern centered at chest height, the design drawing his focus inward, away from everything else. He lifted the device carefully, aligning it with the center of the pattern, not forcing it, not searching for an exact fit, but allowing the motion to follow instinct rather than calculation. And as the device neared the surface, something subtle shifted, not a sound, not a movement, but a change in the air itself, a quiet adjustment that felt like recognition rather than reaction. For a brief second, Ethan held it there, not pressing it forward, not pulling it back, simply allowing the moment to exist. And in that stillness, the path that had brought him here felt complete in a way he could not fully explain, not because it had ended, but because it had led exactly where it was meant to, without deviation, without confusion. Rex let out a soft breath beside him, the faintest sound in the silent chamber, and as Ethan's fingers tightened, slightly around the device. He understood that whatever came next was not something to be forced or rushed. It was something that would reveal itself in the same way everything else had, quietly, deliberately, and only when he was ready to see it. For a moment, nothing happened, and that nothing felt important, not empty, not disappointing, but intentional, as if the space itself required stillness before it would respond, and Ethan remained where he was. The device held steady in his hands, its surface aligned with the center of the circular pattern, his breath slow, his focus quiet. Rex did not move, his presence beside Ethan unwavering, his gaze fixed on the same point, not searching for change, but waiting for it, the same way he had waited at every step along the path that had led them here. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the air shifted, not with a sound, but with a subtle pressure, like the faintest change in temperature that could only be noticed if someone was paying attention, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. A gentle vibration traveling through the surface of the wall, not forceful, not abrupt, but steady, controlled, as if something beneath the surface had begun to awaken. The symbols within the circular pattern seemed to respond, not lighting up, not glowing, but deepening in tone, their edges becoming more defined, more present, as if they were no longer just markings but part of a system that had been waiting to be activated. Ethan did not pull the device away. He did not press it further. He simply held it there, allowing the connection to settle. And as the vibration continued, the center of the circle shifted inward by a fraction, the movement so precise it could have been missed if he had blinked. Rex let out a soft breath, a low exhale that seemed to match the rhythm of the change, and Ethan felt something align within him, not understanding in words, but recognition in instinct, the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the moment Rex first stopped at the basement wall. The surface beneath the device responded again, this time more clearly, a faint separation forming along the inner edge of the circular pattern, creating a narrow gap that traced the design, not opening fully, but enough to suggest that something beneath it was preparing to move. Ethan adjusted his grip slightly, not out of uncertainty, but to steady his hands as the shift continued, and the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, but deep, a low, controlled movement that resonated through the chamber like a distant echo of something long at rest. The circular section of the wall began to recede, not quickly, not forcefully, but with a measured motion that mirrored everything else he had experienced in this place, deliberate, precise, as if it had been designed to open only under the right conditions, only when the sequence had been followed exactly as intended. As the opening widened, a space beyond revealed itself, not another chamber like the one they stood in, but something different, something more contained, more focused, and as the light from Ethan's flashlight reached into it, the details emerged slowly, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was not storage, not a passage, but a destination. Inside, resting at the center of a recessed platform, was a structure unlike anything he had seen before, not large, not imposing, but intricate, its surface composed of interlocking segments that reflected the same patterns he had followed from the beginning. Each piece aligned with the next in a way that suggested function rather than decoration. Rex stepped forward slightly, stopping just short of the opening, his posture calm, his gaze steady, as if acknowledging that this was the point they had been moving toward, the place where the path no longer led forward, but inward. Ethan lowered the device slowly, not removing it entirely, but easing it back just enough to break the direct alignment, and as he did, the movement within the wall paused, holding the opening at its current state, neither closing nor expanding, as if waiting for the next action. He took a step closer, the beam of light shifting to fully illuminate the structure within, and as the details sharpened, he noticed something that made him pause, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, a small indentation at the center of the structure, shaped not randomly, but with the same dimensions as the device he held, the same proportions, the same subtle design that had guided every step so far. Rex glanced at him then, just briefly, his eyes steady, his presence unchanged, and in that look, there was no instruction, no urgency, only confirmation, the quiet understanding that the next step had already been placed in Ethan's hands. The chamber remained still, the air steady, the symbols around the opening holding their deeper tone, as if everything within this space had reached a point of balance, waiting not for force, not for guesswork, but for a choice made with awareness. Ethan looked at the device again, then back at the structure within the opening. The connection no longer subtle, no longer something that needed to be interpreted, but something that had been built to be completed. And as he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the recessed platform, he understood that whatever this was, whatever had been set into motion long before he arrived, had now reached the moment where it required him to do more than follow. It required him to act. The space seemed to hold its breath as Ethan stepped forward, the distance between him and the recessed platform narrowing until the structure filled his view completely. Every line, every interlocking segment now clear under the beam of his light. And for a moment he did not move, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself felt complete, as if everything leading here had been preparing him to recognize what he was now seeing. The indentation at the center was exact, not approximate. Not similar, but precise in a way that removed doubt entirely. And Ethan felt that quiet certainty settle deeper. The same steady awareness that had followed him since the beginning. Not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore. Rex remained just behind him, close enough that Ethan could feel his presence without looking. The dog's breathing slow and even, a quiet rhythm that grounded the stillness of the chamber. Ethan lifted the device slightly, turning it once in his hands, feeling its weight, its balance, and for a brief second, he thought of the path that had brought it here, the hidden wall, the chamber beneath the house, the journal, the coordinates, each step revealing just enough to continue, never more, never less. He stepped closer until he stood directly before the opening, the platform just within reach, and as he extended his hands forward, the motion felt less like a decision and more like a continuation, as if this moment had already been set into motion long before he ever touched the device. The metal surface of the structure reflected a faint outline of the device as it approached, the alignment so natural it required no adjustment, and when the edges met, there was no resistance, no force needed, only a soft, precise contact that felt more like completion than insertion. For a second, nothing happened, and again, that nothing carried weight, not emptiness, but anticipation held in perfect stillness. Then, slowly, the structure responded, not with sudden movement, but with a subtle shift that began at the center and moved outward, each segment adjusting by fractions, aligning more tightly, more deliberately, as if the device had not activated it, but completed it. Ethan kept his hands steady, not pulling away, not pressing further, allowing the process to unfold in its own time. And as the segment settled, a faint tone emerged, not a sound in the usual sense, but a vibration that could be felt more than heard, low and steady, resonating through the platform, through the floor, through the air itself. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears angling forward, his body still calm, as if he recognized the change without needing to react to it. The tone deepened gradually, not growing louder, but fuller, as if more of the space was beginning to respond, and the symbols along the wall behind Ethan shifted again, their tone darkening. Further, their lines more defined, as though the entire chamber had become part of a single system now moving in quiet synchronization. The structure at the center continued to adjust, each segment sliding into place with precise, controlled motion, revealing small openings between them, not gaps, but intentional spaces that formed a pattern Ethan had not seen before, a configuration that seemed to mirror the markings on the map, the coordinates, the network of points that had connected everything from the beginning. Ethan felt something change within him then, not confusion, not clarity, but alignment, the sense that he was no longer just following a path, but standing within it, part of it, the same way the device had become part of the structure. As the final segment settled into place, the tone shifted again, softening slightly, becoming steadier, more even, and the space within the recessed platform changed, not opening further, not revealing something hidden behind it, but becoming something else entirely, a surface that had been complex now appearing unified, complete, as if the purpose of the structure had not been to conceal, but to connect. Rex stepped forward then, just one step, stopping beside Ethan, his gaze fixed on the center of the platform, his posture relaxed, almost at ease, as if the tension of the path had been replaced by something quieter, something resolved. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, releasing the device, leaving it in place, and when he did, the structure remained stable, unchanged, holding its form without any sign of reversal, as if it had accepted the completion without question. The chamber around them grew still again, but this stillness felt different, not waiting, not anticipatory, but settled, as though something that had been incomplete for a long time had finally reached its intended state. Ethan stepped back slightly, his eyes moving from the structure to the walls, to the symbols, to the space itself, seeing it now not as a series of hidden elements, but as a single, connected design, each part meaningful only in relation to the others. Rex exhaled softly beside him, the faint sound barely noticeable, and Ethan rested his hand briefly on the dog's back, the contact grounding, real, a reminder that whatever this was, whatever had been set into motion long before, it had led them both here, not by accident, but by something far more deliberate, something that had not just been waiting to be found, but waiting to be understood. The chamber no longer felt like a place waiting to reveal something. It felt like a place that had already revealed what it was meant to. And in that quiet completion, Ethan stood still, not searching for what came next, but allowing the stillness to settle fully around him. The low vibration now faded into something softer, almost imperceptible, like the echo of a note that had already been played. The structure before him remained unchanged, the device resting at its center as if it had always belonged there, no longer separate, no longer something to be carried, but something that had become part of a larger whole. And for a moment, Ethan simply watched it, not expecting movement, not expecting anything at all, just taking in the way the space felt different now, calmer, steadier, as though a long-held tension had finally been released. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his posture relaxed, his gaze no longer fixed on the platform, but moving slowly across the chamber, as if confirming that there was nothing left to uncover here, nothing hidden, nothing waiting in the same way it had before. Ethan followed that quiet shift, turning his attention outward, looking at the walls again, at the symbols that now seemed less mysterious, less like something to decode, and more like something that had always been meant to guide rather than conceal. He stepped back a few paces, the sound of his boots soft against the smooth floor, and as he did, the light from his flashlight moved across the chamber in a slow arc, revealing details he had not noticed before, not because they had been hidden, but because they had not been relevant until now. Near the base of the wall, just below the circular pattern that had opened, something caught the edge of the light, a small panel set lower than the rest, almost at knee height, its outline subtle but distinct now that the rest of the structure had settled. Ethan approached it without urgency, the same steady pace that had carried him through every step so far, and when he crouched, he saw that it was not sealed like the others had been, but slightly recessed, as if it had been designed to be accessed after everything else had been completed. Rex stepped closer again, lowering his head to the panel, his nose hovering just above it, his breathing slow, calm, as if whatever lay behind it carried none of the uncertainty that had marked the earlier discoveries. Ethan reached out and pressed lightly against the edge, and the panel responded immediately, sliding open with a smooth, controlled motion that made no sound beyond the faintest shift of air, revealing a shallow compartment within. Inside, there was no complex structure, no device, no intricate design, only a single object resting at the center, placed with the same careful intention that had defined everything else, a small metal case, simpler than the one he had carried, its surface worn slightly at the edges, as if it had been handled before being placed here. Ethan lifted it slowly, the weight light, almost unnoticeable, and when he opened it, the hinge moved easily, revealing its contents without resistance. Inside was a folded letter, the paper aged but intact, its edges softened by time, and beneath it, a single photograph, different from the one he had found earlier, not a group, but a single image, a man standing alone beside a structure that looked familiar in a way Ethan could not immediately place, his expression calm, steady, the kind of look that suggested he knew something others did not. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully, the paper making a faint sound as it opened. And as his eyes moved across the first line, the same handwriting greeted him. Again, but this time, the tone was different, not observational, not reflective, but direct, personal, as if it had been written specifically for the person who would find it. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. If you have reached this point, then you have followed the path as it was meant to be followed. And Ethan felt that quiet recognition again. Not surprise, not disbelief, but confirmation, the sense that everything he had done had not just been correct, but expected. He continued reading, the words steady, deliberate, each line unfolding with the same patience that had defined the entire journey. And as the meaning settled in, it became clear that this was not the end of something hidden, but the beginning of something understood, a message left not to reveal a secret, but to pass on a responsibility, something that could not be explained all at once, but had to be experienced, step by step, just as he had done. Rex sat beside him now, his body relaxed, his presence quiet, and as Ethan lowered the letter slightly, looking once more at the photograph beneath it, he realized that the man in the image was not unfamiliar after all, not because he had seen him before, but because he recognized the expression, the same quiet certainty, the same steady understanding that had guided him here. The chamber remained still around them, no longer waiting, no longer shifting, simply present. And as Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the case, holding it for a moment before closing it again, he understood that whatever had been left here had never been about discovery alone. It had been about continuation, about carrying something forward that could not remain hidden forever, but could only be revealed to those willing to follow the path without forcing it. And as the quiet settled once more, deeper now, more complete, Ethan realized that he was no longer standing at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of one that had already begun long before he ever took the first step. The letter remained in Ethan's hands a moment longer than necessary, not because he was still reading it, but because something in its presence felt anchored, like a point of stillness in a path that had been unfolding piece by piece. And when he finally closed the case and stood, the movement felt quieter than before, not cautious, not uncertain, but complete in a way that did not need to be rushed. Rex rose beside him, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer fixed on any single point. And together they stood in the chamber that no longer felt hidden, no longer felt like something waiting to be discovered, but something that had already fulfilled its purpose simply by being understood. Ethan looked once more at the structure where the device now rested, the surface unchanged, the pattern settled, and for a brief moment, he placed his hand lightly against the edge of the recessed platform, not to test it, not to move it, but simply to acknowledge it, the same way one might pause at a place that had quietly changed them without needing to explain how. The air remained still, the faint trace of that earlier vibration now gone completely, leaving behind only a calm, steady silence that felt neither empty nor heavy, just present. Rex turned toward the steps without being told, his movement natural, unforced, and Ethan followed, the small metal case now secured in his pack, its weight subtle but undeniable in its meaning. And as they began the ascent, the light above appeared gradually, widening with each step until the chamber below faded into shadow once more, not disappearing, but settling back into its place, unchanged, waiting for nothing more. When they reached the surface, the forest greeted them with the same quiet it had held before, but it no longer felt untouched. It felt connected, as though the ground beneath every tree carried echoes of something deeper, something that did not need to be seen to be present. Ethan stepped out into the clearing, the morning light now stronger, casting longer shadows across the earth, and he paused there, not looking back immediately, but letting the moment settle, the awareness that the place behind him was no longer a question, no longer a mystery, but part of a larger understanding that extended beyond the boundaries of the forest. Rex stood at his side, his gaze moving across the trees, the horizon, the quiet line where the land stretched outward, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The stillness shared, steady, unspoken. Ethan reached into his pocket and unfolded the coordinate one last time. The numbers now familiar in a way they had not been before, not because he had memorized them, but because he understood their purpose, not as a destination alone, but as a point in something that continued, something that would extend beyond this place, beyond this moment. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back, his hand lingering there for a second before dropping to his side. And when he finally turned back toward the direction of the house, the path felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The walk back was quiet, the same trees, the same ground, the same subtle curve of the path, but each step carried a sense of completion rather than search. And when the house came back into view through the thinning line of trees, it no longer looked like a place of isolation, but a point of origin, a place where something had begun without him realizing it. Rex moved ahead slightly, his pace easy, unhurried, and when they reached the edge of the yard, he paused briefly, looking back once, not questioning, not waiting, but simply acknowledging, and Ethan gave the faintest nod, the gesture small but certain. They stepped onto the porch together, the wood creaking softly beneath their weight, the same sound as before, but now carrying none of the uncertainty it once had. And as Ethan opened the door, letting the quiet interior welcome them back, he understood that the house itself had not changed, only his place within it had. He moved through the room slowly, not searching, not expecting anything new, just observing, the light shifting across the floor, the air steady, the silence no longer something to fill, but something to accept. Rex settled near the doorway, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed but still aware, and Ethan stood for a moment in the center of the room, the weight of everything that had happened settling not as confusion, not as urgency, but as something simpler, something quieter, something that did not demand answers all at once. He reached up and rested his hand briefly against the wall, the same wall that had hidden the first sign of what lay beneath, and for a second, he allowed himself to feel the stillness there, the absence of movement, the quiet that now felt complete rather than uncertain. Then he stepped back, letting his hand fall, and moved toward the window, looking out at the trees, the clearing beyond, the direction he had come from, and the direction that now lay ahead. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching him, not questioning, not urging, just present, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, the moment grounded, and in that quiet space between what had been found and what had yet to come, he understood something that did not need to be written, did not need to be explained, that some paths are not meant